There's this common belief within the Word of Faith community where suffering and poverty are not for believers, and that if you're sick or poor, that it's not God's will, but it's because of your disobedience and sin. That's not necessarily the case, and I'm going to show you, using the scriptures, why that is wrong and could be seen as arrogant. And so we see here in the book of Job an instance of a man who has everything stripped away from him, yet in spite of this, in the end, still worships God for who he is. Job's friends, throughout the entirety of this 42 chapter tragic yet poetic book, are convinced that God is doing this to Job because of some wrongdoing or some sin on Job's behalf. Whereas Job has a different perspective, where he believes that he's a righteous man, and that in a sense somehow God is mistaken or the one to be questioned. And so we see throughout the book of Job this constant back and forth from Job and his friends, and back to Job and his friends. And his friends are saying, you are doing this. You are experiencing all of these things. You lost your family, you lost your riches, you lost your health, you lost all of these things because you're in some kind of sin. And Job is sticking to his ground and saying, no, I am not in sin. I am a righteous man, and so on and so forth. And we see throughout this back and forth between Job and his friends that that God's it's God's judgment that's being questioned ultimately, right? So in their arrogance, Job's friend, I say arrogant because they firstly are making the assumption that they understand God, or that they can even speak on behalf of God, because we see Job in the beginning of the book of Job, how he questions, why is this happening to me? Why would this happen to me? I'm a righteous man, right? We see when God finally responds to Job in Job chapter 38, which I suggest you go and read for full context of the book. But when the Lord finally responds to Job and gives him a description of God's nature, gives him a description of his nature, Job is basically left speechless. Job says, I know you can do all things. No purpose of yours can be thwarted. You asked, who is this that obscures my plans without knowledge? Surely I spoke of things I did not understand, things too wonderful for me to know. And so, by the nature of God, Job is left speechless. All these questions are kind of made null and void, right? Because he's standing in the presence of a holy and just God. And so the lessons we can learn from the book of Job are firstly one of humility in our limited human understanding of God and his creation, and that we, like Job and Job's friends, cannot reduce God's moral rule to a simple formula. You do good, good come to you. You do bad, bad come to you. But that God is much more complex than that. And his moral rule and his decisions cannot be reduced to just simple formulas, right? Because these formulas, in a sense, they undermine God's sovereignty, and that there are things about God that we just cannot understand, right? In more modern words, things that are just above our pay grade. And then we see through Job's experience, when Job is given his response to his friends, he poses a question somewhere in there. The question is, what's the point of being righteous if both, if good and bad things happen to both the wicked and the righteous? What do I gain from being a righteous man? What do I benefit from being a righteous man? Yes, good things and bad things happen to good and bad people that believe in God and people that don't believe in God. That's not an excuse to go on sinning, because we know how Paul addressed this, not this specifically, but Paul addressed this in a sense when he said, even though now we are under grace, does that mean we keep on sinning? Should we go on sinning that grace may abound? No. Now we seek all the more righteousness, right? And so we see this said in Matthew 5, verse 45. God causes his sun to rise on the evil and the good, and sends rain on the righteous and the unrighteous, right? And so simply put, God does not show favoritism, and that good circumstances, good circumstances and bad circumstances will happen and will come upon both those who are righteous and walk according to the will of God, and those who are unrighteous, who outright reject God. And that God views us as equals, and that our righteous works and that our good deeds are as filthy rags in front of God, right? We are not better or we're not more important than other people because of our works and because of our belief even in God, right? And so good things will happen and bad things will happen regardless of who you are. And Jesus is speaking about this when he's giving the Sermon on the Mount to the disciples, and he's telling them that they should pray for their enemies and they should pray for those who persecute them, and that ultimately God is holy and just, and us, like Job, when we stand in front of a holy and just God, we're left speechless just by his nature, by his very nature. The questions that once seemed like a big deal and once seemed like they had any ground to stand on in front of God, when that question is brought in front of God, God's very nature leaves you speechless, right? Because when you're in front of a holy God, you become aware of how holy and just and good he is. Because in that moment we realize how out of our league we are, and that our reasonings and our understandings could not even compare to the reasonings and understandings of the God that made the cosmos.